I was ordered to pay a $250,000 fine for violations of their HOA rules over the last 5 years, on top of legal fees and penalties for unauthorized construction they had concocted. This was all happening on the land I had just inherited. The ironic part is that they were the ones who had constructed homes on my property. This is just the start of a conflict where I, an IT engineer who unexpectedly became a Montana rancher, was forced to confront a formidable HOA board with influence across the county. When they made threats to place a lien on my grandfather's ranch, I prepared for a fight and did something no one had dared to attempt before. I had never imagined I would be battling for a piece of land I was not even certain I wanted. 6 months prior, I was Mike Carson, a 35-year-old software engineer residing in Seattle. Then the tech industry experienced a downturn, and my secure six-figure salary vanished, along with those of thousands of others in the field. The startup to which I had dedicated 3 years of my life went under overnight as our funding evaporated. I can still picture our CEO's expression during that last company-wide meeting. It was a blend of resignation and disbelief as he announced there was no money left for severance packages. In an instant, I was out of a job with rent looming in 2 weeks, the pressure of Seattle's high cost of living weighing heavily on me. I began my job search at once, but the market was saturated with skilled engineers, all vying for the few available positions. 2 weeks into my sudden unemployment, I got word that my grandfather, James Carson, had died at the age of 89. We had been very close when I was a child, but as my adult life became more demanding, my trips to his Montana ranch grew infrequent. The phone call from his attorney affected me deeply. It wasn't just that I had lost the man who taught me how to fish and ride horses during those summers of my youth, but also because he had bequeathed his entire 100-acre ranch to me, his sole grandchild. I drove to Montana with conflicted emotions. The ranch was filled with wonderful memories, but I was clueless about how to manage one. To be honest, my initial plan was to tidy it up, sell it, and use the proceeds to begin my life anew in Seattle. The journey from Washington to Montana provided ample time to reflect on summers spent trailing my grandfather as he repaired fences, cared for his small cattle herd, and shared stories of how the land had been in our family for generations. As a boy, I had cherished every moment. As an adult, I viewed it from a different perspective: the flaking paint on the barn, the antiquated machinery, the profound isolation. However, as I turned onto the long gravel driveway, something seemed different. The vast landscape was just as I recalled: wide open fields, the small barn, and Grandpa James's modest 2-bedroom home perched on a gentle rise overlooking a creek. What had changed was the expanse of identical luxury houses visible in the distance, just past what I believed was our property line. The house was precisely as my grandfather had left it, right down to the half-finished mug of coffee in the sink. A layer of dust covered everything, and a sense of emptiness pervaded the space that was more than just the physical absence of my grandfather. His worn leather armchair was positioned by the window with a view of the fields, a book still open on the end table, as though he had only stepped away for a minute. I traced my fingers along his old desk, recalling him sitting there in the evenings, writing in his journal. As I was organizing some papers on his desk, I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to see an elderly woman, likely in her 70s, with steely gray hair tied in a no-nonsense ponytail and the kind of suntanned, weathered skin that results from decades of working outdoors. "You must be James's grandson," she stated directly. "I'm Barbara Thompson. Barb, your grandfather's neighbor for 30 years. I heard you inherited this place." Her handshake was remarkably strong. James was a good man, one of the few around who didn't back down when those vultures started circling. Before I could inquire about her meaning, she gestured toward a bright, white envelope I had found lodged in the door upon my arrival. I hadn't opened it, thinking it was a sympathy card or a note from the local church. "You should probably read that," she advised. That sort of thing was happening to James for months before he passed. It's one of the things that made his health decline, if you want my opinion. I ripped open the envelope as Barb settled herself at the kitchen table, evidently preparing for what she anticipated would be a long discussion. Inside was a formal-looking letter from an entity called the Sun Valley Homeowners Association, demanding the immediate payment of $250,000 for accumulated violations, legal fees, and unauthorized construction penalties going back 5 years. The letter provided a detailed list, $75 for failure to maintain the property to community standards, $50 for unauthorized agricultural activity in a residential area, $40 for improper fencing and boundary markers, and a staggering $850 in legal and administrative costs. The letter warned of placing a lien on the property if the payment was not made within 30 days. "What on earth is this?" I exclaimed, looking over the document in astonishment. "Grandpa's ranch isn't part of any development. And what violations? This house has looked the same for 40 years. Barb scoffed. "That's Victoria Reynolds and her Sun Valley HOA. About 5 years back, they began building that upscale community you saw coming in. It started small, but it's been spreading like a disease. Your grandfather wouldn't sell when they made an offer, so they've been trying to push him out ever since, claiming parts of his land were actually inside their development's boundaries and that he was violating their precious rules." I sat down heavily, facing her. "But how can they just claim land that doesn't belong to them? There have to be property records and surveys." "That's precisely what your grandfather argued," Barb responded, with a note of respect in her eyes. "He was fighting this, you know. He was certain something was off with their surveys. He was in the process of gathering proof when his heart failed him." She paused, then added in a quieter tone, "James told me that if anything were to happen to him, I needed to ensure you were aware of the boundary problem. He said there was a folder in his study labeled Boundaries with an old map. He said you'd be clever enough to figure it out." "Did he speak to an attorney?" I asked, still trying to grasp that my inheritance included $250,000 in fraudulent fines. "He tried," Barb said, her face clouding over. "But Victoria has half the lawyers in this county on retainer for one reason or another, and the rest who aren't working for her are afraid to oppose her. Your grandfather was planning a trip to Billings to find someone there when he—" She trailed off, and I nodded in understanding. I spent the subsequent hours searching through my grandfather's impressively organized files until I located it, a worn manila folder with boundaries inscribed in his unsteady handwriting. Inside was a frayed 1952 map of the original property from when my great-grandfather bought it, along with more recent survey documents and notes in my grandfather's script questioning the current boundary markers. There were also photos of old fence posts and stone markers that had once marked the original property line, some of which were now situated deep within what was evidently the Sun Valley development. Examining the documents, I understood his suspicion. The property line on the newer papers seemed to have moved substantially when compared to the original map. That night, sleep eluded me. I kept picturing my grandfather's last months, alone and harassed by this HOA, convinced his land was being usurped but unable to find help. I reflected on my own circumstances, unemployed, with no job prospects, and now confronting a legal fight I never sought. A part of me just wanted to sell the property and be done with it all. But another part, a voice that sounded remarkably like my grandfather, kept insisting that some things are worth fighting for. The following morning, with Barb along for moral support, I went to the county records office. The building was an imposing brick edifice that might have been impressive in the 1950s but now appeared worn and neglected. The clerk at the counter, Jenny, was a local institution who had worked there for decades and remembered my grandfather with affection. "James was in here frequently in his final months," she informed us as she accessed the digital files. "He was certain something wasn't right with that new development's boundary claims." She lowered her voice. "Just between us, many longtime residents feel the same about Victoria Reynolds. She has money and influence, and things have a way of going in her favor around here, if you catch my drift." She turned the monitor so we could see. "This is the official county survey from 1952 when your great-grandfather purchased the property. And this," she said, bringing up another document, "is the survey that Sun Valley Development filed in 2019 when they started construction on their project's second phase." The discrepancy was instantly obvious. According to the original survey, my grandfather's property extended a good 300 yards farther than what the new survey indicated, right into what was now the latest section of the Sun Valley development. "Can we have an independent survey conducted to verify this?" I inquired. Jenny nodded. "I've already called Bill Matthews. He's the most reputable surveyor in the county and, more importantly, has no business affiliations with Victoria Reynolds or Sun Valley. He can be out here tomorrow morning." "That seems unusually accommodating," I remarked, wary of how easily this was proceeding. Jenny smiled. "Your grandfather had many friends in this area, Mr. Carson. more than he likely knew. People who would like to see justice done. Bill arrived promptly at 8 a.m. the next day. He was a reserved man in his 60s who communicated mostly in grunts while setting up his equipment. He had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his life working outdoors, and his hands were covered in calluses that attested to physical labor, despite his professional role. For hours, we traversed the property as he took measurements, referenced GPS coordinates, and took notes. I attempted to make small talk, but Bill was a man who preferred to do his work with little conversation. By mid-afternoon, he was prepared to give his assessment. Based on the original property markers, county records, and GPS verification, he stated, gesturing to a map spread across the hood of his truck. Approximately 10 acres of what is currently being used as part of the Sun Valley development is, in fact, on your land, Mr. Carson. This includes about 15 houses in their newest section and half of their clubhouse. A wave of anger mixed with validation washed over me. So, they had built houses on my grandfather's land and then had the audacity to fine him for violations. Bill shrugged. It wouldn't be the first instance of a developer attempting to shift boundary lines to their benefit. But this case is particularly blatant. You have a very strong case here. He folded his maps with practiced ease. I'll get the official, notarized report to you by tomorrow. You'll need a good lawyer. That's the issue, I said. My neighbor mentioned that Victoria Reynolds has most of the local attorneys occupied. Bill grunted. Contact Ben Hawkins in Billings. He's my brother-in-law, a tenacious man who specializes in property disputes. Tell him I recommended you. With that, he packed his gear and departed, leaving me in my grandfather's field with my mind racing with plans. Armed with Bill's official report, I drove directly to the Sun Valley HOA office, an extravagant building designed to resemble a rustic mountain lodge, though every detail of it suggested new wealth. Inside, a water feature dominated the lobby, and tasteful landscape photos of Montana adorned the walls. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfect hairstyle and a practiced smile, looked me up and down with barely hidden condescension when I brought up my grandfather's property. Ms. Reynolds is exceptionally busy, she informed me. If this concerns the violation notice, you can file a written appeal with the HOA board. It's about more than that, I responded, maintaining a polite but firm tone. I possess evidence that Sun Valley has been building on Carson property. I believe Ms. Reynolds will want to address this personally. The mention of evidence altered her attitude. After a hushed phone call, she escorted me to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the development. Seated behind a large desk was Victoria Reynolds, a polished woman in her mid-40s, dressed in what appeared to be a $1,000 suit and wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her dark hair was styled in a severe bob that framed a face that was beautiful in a cold, calculating manner. Everything about her projected an aura of control and confidence. Mr. Carson, it's a pleasure to finally meet you, she said, not bothering to rise. I was saddened to learn about your grandfather. James was, shall we say, resistant to progress. I trust you will be more open-minded about becoming part of our community. I placed Bill's survey report on her desk. I believe you've been constructing your community on land that is not yours, Ms. Reynolds. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she glanced at the document without picking it up. Ah, an independent survey. How charming. Our development was sanctioned by county planners based on professional surveys carried out by the most esteemed firm in the state. A firm that your company happens to have on retainer, I retorted, recalling what Barb had told me. Victoria leaned back in her chair, a flicker of amusement on her face. Mr. Carson, you've been in town for what, 2 days? And you're already making accusations based on some old maps and the word of a surveyor who is likely a friend of your grandfather's. That is not how we conduct business here. How do you conduct business, Ms. Reynolds? By inventing violations against properties you wish to obtain? By redrawing boundary lines to suit your needs? Victoria leaned back in her chair. Mr. Carson, I realize you're distressed. The loss of a family member can make one act irrationally, but making baseless accusations won't alter the fact that your grandfather's property has numerous code violations that must be corrected. That is why we were compelled to issue those regrettable fines. Fines for violations on land that isn't even under your HOA's jurisdiction. That seems legally dubious. Her smile completely faded. Let me be very clear, Mr. Carson. Sun Valley is the economic engine of this county. We generate tax income, create employment, and increase property values. Your grandfather's rundown ranch is an eyesore that impedes progress. We have been exceedingly patient, but my patience is wearing thin. Pay the fines, or we will place a lien on the property, and you will eventually lose it entirely." She stood, indicating our meeting was concluded. "Or you could spare yourself the hassle and sell to us now. We are ready to make a fair market offer." As the receptionist appeared to show me out, Victoria added with a saccharine sweetness, "Think about it, Mr. Carson. A software engineer like you has no business playing farmer. This could be beneficial for everyone." I was seething as I drove back to the ranch. How did she know I was a software engineer? It appeared Victoria Reynolds had researched me. Back at the house, Barb was waiting on the porch swing, and I relayed the details of the confrontation. "That woman has been attempting to acquire all the old ranches and farms around here for years," Barb explained. "She makes low-ball offers, and if people refuse to sell, they suddenly start receiving citations for violations of county codes they've never heard of. Most people give in eventually. Your grandfather was one of the few who held out." "Well, I'm not selling," I declared, surprised by the sudden certainty in my voice. "Not after this. She built on our land and then tried to intimidate Grandpa out of his home with fabricated fines. I'm going to fight this." That evening, I called Ben Hawkins, the lawyer Bill had suggested. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally grunting in what I took to be agreement. When I was done, he said, "Victoria Reynolds has quite the reputation, even in Billings. She's intelligent, ruthless, and typically gets her way. But shifting boundary lines and building on someone else's property, that's not just aggressive business, that's fraud." He agreed to handle the case, but cautioned me that it could be a lengthy and costly battle. Reynolds has deep pockets and is not afraid to use them to overwhelm her opponents with legal fees. I spent that evening investigating the upcoming Sun Valley HOA meeting scheduled for the following week. According to their bylaws, available on their website, non-residents were permitted to attend but could not vote. I intended to be there, equipped with Bill's survey and numerous questions. In the meantime, I explored my grandfather's papers more deeply, trying to comprehend the full scope of his conflict with Victoria. In his journals, I discovered entries dating back 5 years, detailing every interaction, every new claim, and every escalation. Reading his increasingly frustrated words only strengthened my resolve to see this through. The Sun Valley Clubhouse was precisely what I had anticipated. Tastefully luxurious with stone fireplaces, exposed wooden beams, and windows that offered meticulously framed views of the mountains. The irony that half of this structure was on my land was not lost on me as I found a seat at the back of the meeting room. About 50 residents were present, a combination of retirees in golf attire and younger families who looked as though they had stepped out of a catalog for high-end casual clothing. The ambience was one of comfortable affluence, of people accustomed to the finer things in life who expected their environment to mirror their social standing. Victoria presided at the front of the room, accompanied by a thin, nervous-looking man she introduced as Gerald White, the HOA's legal counsel. Gerald had the perpetually worried expression of someone accustomed to rectifying other people's mistakes, his fingers constantly fiddling with his tie or glasses. The meeting commenced with reports on community enhancements, talks about a new landscaping agreement, and discussions over whether to approve a particular shade of beige for exterior paint. It was stupefyingly banal, but I could see how these minor details were of great importance to people who had invested significantly in crafting their ideal suburban haven. When the floor was opened for community issues, I raised my hand and introduced myself. "I'm Mike Carson, James Carson's grandson. I've recently learned that a substantial part of this development, including half of this very clubhouse, appears to have been constructed on land that legally belongs to my family." A murmur spread through the room. Victoria's smile remained fixed, but her eyes grew hard. "Mr. Carson is, understandably, emotional after his grandfather's death," she said smoothly. "Regrettably, he has been misinformed by an unreliable survey that contradicts the official development plans sanctioned by the county. I have the original property maps from 1952, I countered, plus verification from an independent surveyor with no affiliation to Sun Valley. I suspect many of you are residing in homes built on land that was unlawfully taken from my grandfather." Gerald White stepped forward, nervously adjusting his glasses. "These are grave accusations, Mr. Carson, potentially libelous ones. I would recommend caution before making such statements in a public setting." A woman in the third row stood. She was about 40 with dark, curly hair and an intense focus that reminded me of some of the best project managers I had worked with in the tech industry. I would like to see these surveys, she stated. I'm Dana Mitchell, an environmental attorney. I moved here 6 months ago, and if there are questions about the legal standing of our properties, we should address them directly, not with threats. Victoria quickly interjected. We will be pleased to address Mr. Carson's concerns through the appropriate legal channels. This is not the right venue for such conversations. Now, let's proceed to our next agenda item. As the meeting went on, I saw Dana Mitchell observing Victoria with narrowed eyes, periodically taking notes on her phone. Several other residents were whispering among themselves, glancing back at me with expressions that varied from hostility to apprehension. When the meeting concluded, I was encircled by a small group of residents, some hostile, others worried about what my claims could mean for their property values. My family saved for years to build our dream home here, one man said angrily. Are you telling us we might not even own the land it's on? I'm saying Victoria Reynolds may have sold you land that was not hers to sell, I answered. That is an issue between you and her. I am simply trying to safeguard what belongs to my family. An older woman shook her head. This is precisely why we left California. Too many lawsuits, too many regulations. We came here for tranquility. As I attempted to respond to their questions, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Dana Mitchell was there, her expression unreadable. Here's my card, she said softly, handing me a business card. I believe we should talk. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from here. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. I nodded, and she slipped away. As I was departing, a thick envelope was pressed into my hands by Gerald White. Consider this an official cease and desist regarding your disruptive actions and defamatory remarks, he said icily. Furthermore, the HOA board has voted to increase the fine on your property due to your grandfather's ongoing noncompliance. The new total is $300,000, due within 30 days. The coffee shop was bustling when I arrived the next morning, but Dana had reserved a corner table. She was dressed in casual yet expensive attire, with the self-assured demeanor of someone used to being taken seriously. She got straight to the point. I've suspected something was amiss with Victoria in this development since I moved in, she said after we ordered. The HOA fees keep rising for special projects that never seem to happen, and anyone who challenges Victoria is quickly silenced. I showed her Bill's survey and my grandfather's original property documents. She examined them thoroughly, nodding from time to time. This is persuasive evidence, she conceded. But Victoria has substantial financial resources and connections throughout the county. A direct legal confrontation with her could last for years and be incredibly expensive. So, what do you propose? I asked, feeling a sense of defeat. Just allow her to steal my land and extort money from me? Dana smiled for the first time. Not at all. I believe we need a more tactical approach. We don't have to fight the HOA itself. We just need to demonstrate that they have no authority over your land and that they have been building on property they do not own. Over the next hour, Dana laid out a plan. Instead of a direct legal battle that could go on for years, we would collect evidence of wrongdoing and expose it to both the residents and regulatory bodies that would not take kindly to being misled about property boundaries on official records. Victoria's power stems from her capacity to control information and intimidate people, Dana explained. We need to undermine that control, and I think I know how to begin. Over the next few days, Dana put me in touch with Carlos Rodriguez, a construction worker who had been involved in the initial phases of Sun Valley before quitting over what he termed unscrupulous practices. Carlos was in his mid-50s, with deep laugh lines around his eyes that seemed incongruous with his serious expression when talking about Victoria Reynolds. According to him, Victoria had frequently rushed construction schedules and dismissed potential problems with property boundaries. There was this one instance, Carlos told us as we sat on my porch, when one of the surveyors noted something about questionable markers near what is now the clubhouse area. Victoria pulled him aside, and the next day, he was gone from the project. A new surveyor came in. Suddenly, everything was fine. A lot of us thought it was odd, but work was hard to come by. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what you witnessed? Dana inquired. Carlos paused. I still work in construction in this county. Victoria has a lot of influence. I understand, I said, disappointed but not shocked. But, Carlos added, to my surprise, my cousin works in the county records office. Perhaps he could help us investigate those survey modifications unofficially. And I might know a few other guys from the project who saw things they weren't happy about. Our small group expanded when Barb introduced me to Sheriff Tom Dawson, an old friend of my grandfather's. The sheriff was a tall, weathered man in his 60s with the measured way of speaking that comes from decades of navigating small-town politics. He was officially neutral, but he made no secret of his personal opinion of Victoria. "Your grandpa and I fished together for 30 years, he told me during a discreet meeting at the local diner. He was talking about this boundary issue the last time I saw him. He wanted to file a formal complaint, but was still gathering more evidence." He lowered his voice. "I can't officially take a side here, but between us, Victoria Reynolds has been throwing her weight around this county as if she owns it. I wouldn't mind seeing someone finally challenge her." Dana helped me formulate a legal strategy. Instead of merely contesting the HOA fines, we would assert our rightful ownership of the disputed land and seek compensation for its unauthorized use. Carlos agreed to provide a statement about the suspicious survey changes, and Sheriff Dawson assured me he would remain impartial if the situation escalated. Despite the pressure Victoria could exert, we decided to proceed gradually. First, we would formally challenge the fines with a letter from Dana detailing the boundary dispute. Then, once we had Victoria's attention, we would present our larger claim regarding the misappropriated land. As anticipated, Victoria's reaction was aggressive. 3 days after she received our letter, she had Sheriff Dawson serve me with a warning for creating a public nuisance after I installed private property signs near what I now knew was the genuine boundary of my land, which cut directly through several Sun Valley backyards. "Had to deliver this officially," Sheriff Dawson mumbled as he gave me the citation. "But unofficially, she's getting nervous. She's been calling county commissioners, trying to get them to pressure me to stop you." He glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. "Be careful, son. Victoria doesn't play by the rules." This became even clearer when Victoria held a press conference on the courthouse steps, branding me a community agitator whose baseless claims were threatening property values across the region. She portrayed herself as a champion of progress being harassed by a bitter young man who couldn't accept change. "We welcome Mr. Carson to our community," she stated to the small group of local reporters. But his grandfather's refusal to maintain his property to reasonable standards, and now his grandson's efforts to disrupt a flourishing neighborhood with baseless claims, cannot be tolerated. Sun Valley is the future of this county: jobs, tax revenue, and beautiful homes for families. We will not allow one individual's misguided vendetta to obstruct progress. We needed more tangible proof of Victoria's deceit. Dana proposed that I act as a prospective buyer interested in a Sun Valley property to gain access to their sales office and documentation. Simultaneously, she submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to get the original survey records from the county office. Carlos took the greatest risk. He used his contacts to access internal documents from the construction company's storage facility after hours. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. From the sales office, I acquired marketing materials with property descriptions that conflicted with their official filings with the county. Dana's FOIA request showed that the original survey submitted to the county in 2019 had been quietly altered twice, each time pushing the boundary further onto my grandfather's property. Most damningly, Carlos discovered internal emails indicating that Victoria had been explicitly informed about boundary discrepancies but had instructed her team to manage it discreetly and modify the documentation as required. I tried to bring this evidence to the local newspaper, but found that Victoria was a major advertiser and had friendships with the owners. They refused to publish the story, citing ongoing legal disputes. Frustrated but undeterred, I changed my approach and launched a Facebook page named The Truth About Sun Valley HOA, where I started posting our evidence, taking care to present facts rather than accusations that could be considered libelous. The reaction was swift. Current Sun Valley residents began to ask questions, particularly when I posted documents revealing how their HOA fees were being used to finance Victoria's legal battles instead of community projects. Some residents contacted me privately, sharing their own dissatisfactions with Victoria's leadership. A small faction, led by Dana, started organizing to challenge Victoria's dominance of the HOA board. Victoria called an emergency HOA board meeting where she persuaded them to raise their offer for my property to $1 million, well above its market value, to resolve this unfortunate situation quickly and quietly. I rejected the offer publicly on the Facebook page, declaring that I would not sell at any price until the fraudulent fines were rescinded and the boundary issue was addressed honestly. This proved to be the catalyst that attracted broader media attention. Sarah Chin, a A reporter from a larger newspaper in the nearest city contacted me, expressing interest in investigating what she described as a David versus Goliath story about property rights and development. Sarah was in her early 30s, with the sharp, inquisitive nature of someone who took her journalistic duties seriously. She spent days interviewing everyone involved, examining documents, and even locating former employees of Victoria's company who corroborated the pattern of aggressive tactics and boundary manipulation. Sarah's detailed article, Paradise at What Price? The Battle Over Sun Valley's Boundaries, was featured on the front page of the Sunday paper. It presented all sides of the story but included the incriminating evidence we had collected about the manipulated surveys and Victoria's threatening conduct. The article went viral online, with property rights advocates and HOA critics across the country sharing it extensively. Victoria's response was swift and harsh. She filed a $500,000 defamation lawsuit against me, alleging that I was intentionally spreading falsehoods to harm her reputation and business. Concurrently, a small group of Sun Valley residents, led by Dana, began to formally scrutinize the HOA's financial practices and Victoria's leadership. Gerald, sensing a shift in the tide, privately urged Victoria to consider a settlement, but she refused, certain she could still crush what she termed my pathetic rebellion. The case came before Judge Eleanor Simmons for a preliminary hearing. Dana represented me pro bono, presenting our evidence regarding the boundary dispute and arguing that all other matters, including Victoria's defamation claims, were secondary to establishing the correct property lines. Judge Simmons, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s known for her fairness, meticulously reviewed the competing surveys and historical records. Before this court can address any claims of defamation or financial penalties, she announced, we must resolve the factual issue of property ownership. I am ordering a court-supervised survey of the properties in question, with representatives from both sides present. Until that is done, no liens may be placed on Mr. Carson's property, and all fines are suspended pending resolution. She set a full hearing for 3 months later, after the survey could be finished. Victoria was livid as we exited the courtroom. This doesn't change anything, she hissed as she walked past me in the corridor. I have invested too much in Sun Valley to let some tech bro with a nostalgia complex ruin it. My final offer, $2 million for your property. All disputes dropped. Everyone leaves happy. Otherwise, I will ensure this drags on in court until you are bankrupt, with or without Ms. Mitchell's free legal services. I was tempted by the offer. $2 million would set me up comfortably back in Seattle. But something held me back from accepting, a mix of principle and a developing attachment to my grandfather's land. I told Victoria I needed time to think about her offer, but I was actually pursuing a new lead. While tidying my grandfather's home office, I found a hidden compartment in his desk that contained documents I had never seen. Among them was a 1975 contract between my grandfather and a company called Western Water Resources, granting them mineral rights to extract groundwater from beneath the ranch in exchange for yearly royalty payments. The contract had specific coordinates for the water rights, many of which were now under Sun Valley homes. What made this discovery truly astounding was that Western Water Resources had gone bankrupt in the 1990s, and its assets, including this water rights contract, had been bought by Cascade Development Group, which, according to the corporation records I found online, was Victoria Reynolds' parent company for all her development projects. Dana confirmed that the contract was still legally enforceable, and Victoria would have been aware of it from her company's due diligence when it acquired Western Water's assets. The annual royalties had not been paid to my grandfather for years, meaning Victoria's company likely owed the Carson estate hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in back payments. More importantly, the contract provided undeniable proof that she knew exactly where the true property boundaries were. I arranged a private meeting with Victoria, who agreed, probably thinking I was ready to accept her buyout offer. We met in her office, where I presented the water rights contract without any preamble. "Where did you find this?" she demanded, her composure finally breaking as she recognized the document. "My grandfather kept better records than your company anticipated," I replied calmly. "You've known all along where the real boundaries are. You knew you were building on Carson land, and you knew your company owed my family years of royalty payments for water rights." Victoria's face hardened as she assessed her options. "What do you want?" "I want what is rightfully mine. The land, the back payments, and a public admission of what you've done." She laughed, a cold, sharp sound. Do you have any clue who you are dealing with? I built this entire empire from the ground up. I am not going to let some farmer's grandson bring it down. I have ways of making problems vanish that don't involve courts, Mr. Carson. Is that a threat? I asked, my hand moving to my pocket where my phone was recording our entire conversation. Victoria waved dismissively. I don't care if you're recording this. No one will believe you anyway. You think you're the first person who has tried to stand in the way of progress? They all give in eventually. Her voice lowered to a menacing tone. One way or another. I left the meeting with exactly what I had hoped for. Victoria on record threatening me and essentially admitting she knew about the boundary issues. Montana is a one-party consent state for recordings, which meant I could legally record our conversation as long as I was a participant. And her statement about not caring if I recorded made it even more solid. With all our evidence collected, the original boundary documents, the manipulated surveys, Carlos's testimony about the cover-up, the water rights contract, and now Victoria's recorded threats, I was prepared to make my final move. Since the 10 disputed acres were now officially recognized as not being under the HOA's jurisdiction, I decided to hold a public information meeting on my own land, right at the edge of the contested area. I invited all Sun Valley residents, many of whom were now deeply worried about the legal status of their properties. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, over 100 people gathered on the disputed land. I had set up a simple podium and a screen to project documents. Dana stood by my side as I systematically presented all our evidence, including Victoria's threatening statements from the recording. Victoria tried to interrupt several times, but the residents themselves asked her to remain silent so they could hear the complete story. When I concluded, the atmosphere was thick with tension. These people had invested their life savings into homes that might be partially built on unlawfully acquired land. They were angry, but their anger was now aimed at Victoria, not me. Here is what I am proposing, I said, looking directly at Victoria, who stood rigid with fury at the back of the group. I will not pursue legal action for the back royalties on the water rights contract if 3 conditions are met. First, all HOA fines against my property are permanently voided. Second, Ms. Reynolds resigns from the HOA board and sells her ownership stake in the remaining undeveloped parts of Sun Valley. And third, the new HOA board negotiates a fair lease agreement with me for the disputed land, ensuring you can all stay in your homes without legal jeopardy. The residents murmured among themselves, and Dana quickly clarified that this was the most direct resolution to a potentially years-long legal ordeal that could leave many of them financially devastated. One by one, they expressed their support for my proposal. A middle-aged man in a golf shirt stood up. I bought my retirement home here 2 years ago. I am not about to lose it because he pointed at Victoria, decided to cut corners and lie about property lines. I say we accept Mr. Carson's deal. An elderly woman nodded in agreement. We came here for peace and community, not to be pawns in someone's real estate game. I second the motion. By the end of the meeting, they had resolved to hold an official HOA vote at their next meeting, with most indicating they would approve the terms. The crowd slowly dispersed, with many stopping to thank me for being so reasonable in a situation that could have been much worse for them. Gerald White, spotting an opportunity, quickly came over to me. I believe this is a very sensible solution, he said, as if he hadn't been threatening me with legal action just weeks ago. I would be delighted to help draft the new lease agreement, pro bono, of course. I couldn't help but smile at his abrupt change of heart. I think Dana has that handled, but thank you for the offer. Victoria had not moved from her position at the back of the clearing, her face a mask of cold rage. When nearly everyone was gone, she walked toward me slowly, her designer heels sinking slightly into the soft ground of what was legally my land. This is not over, she said quietly. You have no idea what you have set in motion. I met her gaze without flinching. Actually, I didn't start anything. You did, when you chose to steal my grandfather's land. I'm just putting an end to it. She turned and walked away without another word, her stiff posture revealing the fury she was barely holding back. The official HOA vote took place the following week, and the result was clear. Victoria was ousted from the board, with Dana elected as her replacement. All fines against my property were nullified, and a fair lease agreement was established for the disputed land, giving me a consistent income while letting the residents keep their homes without legal issues. Victoria was compelled to sell her ownership interest in the development and left the area, her reputation ruined. Sarah's ongoing reporting uncovered that she had used similar methods in other communities, triggering broader investigations into her business dealings and several more lawsuits from other property owners who had been similarly intimidated. As for me, I chose not to sell the ranch after all. With the income from the land lease, I started transforming the property into an agricultural education center for local children, realizing a dream my grandfather had mentioned in his journals. Over the subsequent months, I learned more about ranching from Barb and other neighbors than I ever thought possible. I found that my tech skills were surprisingly valuable in modernizing certain aspects of the operation, such as creating irrigation systems with sensors to conserve water and building a website to connect local farmers with regional markets. The residents of Sun Valley gradually developed a positive relationship with the ranch, and the area began to grow in a more sustainable way, with new zoning laws enacted to prevent similar boundary disputes. Some residents even volunteered at the education center, sharing their own knowledge with the children who came to learn about agriculture and conservation. Barb became a frequent visitor, helping me master the basics of ranch management and sharing stories about my grandfather that helped me feel a deeper connection to my heritage. "James would be proud of you," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Not just for standing up to Victoria, but for finding your own place here. That's what he truly wanted for you." I would sometimes get calls from other rural property owners dealing with similar issues with developers, and I would share what I had learned about challenging corporate bullies. Dana and I established a small nonprofit that offered legal advice to those who couldn't afford representation, funded in part by my lease income from Sun Valley. A year after our victory, we celebrated the grand opening of the Carson Agricultural Education Center. The dilapidated barn had been converted into a classroom space, and the fields now featured demonstration plots for sustainable farming methods. Local schools had already scheduled field trips, and we had a waiting list of children for our summer programs. Standing on the porch of the newly renovated farmhouse, looking out over the fields where children would soon learn about sustainable farming, I felt my grandfather's presence. Next to the main gate, I hung a small sign with his favorite saying, "Never underestimate a farmer with an old map." Dana stood beside me, now a close friend and occasional legal advisor. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said, looking at what we had created together. "You didn't just save his land, you gave it a future." I never imagined I would end up here, I confessed. When I lost my job in Seattle, I thought my life was unraveling. It turns out it was just guiding me to something better. As the sun dipped below Montana's rolling hills, I knew I had found something I never anticipated when I first drove up that gravel driveway. Not just a link to my past, but a purpose for my future and a community worth defending. Victoria Reynolds had believed she could intimidate another small landowner into submission. But she had made a critical error. She had built her empire on someone else's foundation. And eventually, that kind of construction always comes crashing down.